MPs say nearly £500 million spent developing the government's flagship welfare reform may have to be written off. The Commons Public Affairs Committee is also warning that oversight of the universal credit scheme, which combines 6 benefits into a single payment, has been alarmingly weak. Mike Sargent reports.
Millions of people who claim a series of different complicated benefits will eventually move to a new system, applying online and getting one monthly payment. The ambitious project is called Universal Credit, but this programme has had a deeply troubled beginning.
Before we start, is there anything that you'd like to comment on?
A tiny number are actually claiming it in a handful of pilots. Ron Bezic went on to Universal Credit in September after losing his building job and hasn't had a smooth experience.
They said they would get me an appointment at the job centre within 2 days. That didn't happen. I had to phone up at my expense. They said they would return my phone calls within 3 hours. That didn't happen.
MPs say £140 million has been wasted on computer systems. The government says the figure is substantially lower. But today's report says the whole project has been blighted by alarmingly weak management.
It's an unmitigated disaster of extraordinary proportions in every aspect of the programme so far.
Ministers say they don't want to play the blame game over what went wrong in the past, but concentrate on the future of this project. There's still the question, though, of who takes responsibility for the serious problems there were. Officials no longer working at the department, senior civil servants still in place, or the ministers themselves.
Labour sources say there was a concerted effort by allies of the Cabinet Minister Iain Duncan Smith to shift blame away from him towards the Permanent Secretary at the department, Robert Devereux. But ministers say they have full confidence in the top civil servant and the new managers now working on Universal Credit.
We put a new team in, new team leader, and we reset the programme to make sure that as we grow it out safely and securely, it will deliver what we need it to deliver.
We're just trying to have a quick chat with people today about changes to benefits.
In Greater Manchester, teams have been trying to explain Universal Credit to the small number of residents affected so far. But there's still a big question. When will this new system be ready for millions of potential claimants? Mike Sargent, BBC News.
Now, Universal Credit was supposed to be the government's big plan to restructure our unwieldy benefit system and save us money. A lot of money. But the government's flagship reform is in fact guilty of shocking failures in management, which have already wasted at least £140 million. The savaging has come from Parliament's Public Accounts Committee, which has voiced doubts about whether Iain Duncan Smith's project can still be fully delivered by 2017. Margaret Hodge is chair of the committee and she joins us now. Margaret Hodge, implementation of the programme has been described as extraordinarily poor, oversight of the universal credit system alarmingly weak and £425 million expenditure to date likely to be written off. You know this because it's come out of your report. How did it happen?
I think they've been driven by a political imperative to meet deadlines, date deadlines, and I think that's a mistake. It's a very complex programme. It's one that has cross-party support, so there's no argument about the policy direction, but it is very complicated, and they just simply shouldn't have been driven by timelines. The second thing is they thought it was a little IT project, and actually this is a big transformation. You're bringing 6 benefits into one. You're trying to change the way in which you work to make work pay, and that takes a lot of thought. And then the third thing is there has been this culture of optimism in the Department for Work and Pensions. They've only put out good news. All too often, the good news isn't the real news. And finally, the chickens have come home to roost. Let me give you one example, Joe. That, for example, they've launched a so-called pilot programme. Actually, the pilot programme is not testing anything. It's only testing a single person without children going for only one of the benefits, job seekers allowance.
OK, but is it, I mean, you're describing it in a way it sounds like a disaster. Is it a disaster?
I think it is at the moment. It's an unmitigated disaster. But is it salvageable? Yes. If they stop having these ridiculous deadlines, time deadlines.
Which deadlines are you talking about? Because 2017 is the deadline. Are you saying that that's just going to be blown? It's not going to be possible to get this universal credit scheme up and running for the majority of claimants by 2017?
It would be much better if they stopped thinking about It's got to be in by 2017, and started thinking about how can we implement this properly. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is they've got to fess up to the money they've wasted so far. It's not the 425 million you mentioned, but they've spent about 300 million on IT. I think probably most of that is wasted. But what my fear is that because of the political, what they'll have to pay for politically in admitting that they're going to try and muddle through and pretend that they can use some of that time in the short term. I would say let's scrap a useless IT system we've got and start again. Then the third thing is, I think they've just got to say, this is a big transformation. We're going to monitor it properly. We're going to take responsibility at the top. And if things start going wrong, we're going to intervene quickly to try and put things right.
Who's to blame?
I think it's from the top down. I never actually name. It's top down. I think it's everybody involved, both the top of the administration and the top of the Department for Work and Pensions. I'm not into scapegoating individuals. They've got to think through what they've got to do. This is an important flagship programme for the government, and they've got to get it right.
I mean, the report, just briefly, the report's in the papers claiming that members of your committee were put under pressure to blame the permanent secretary, to blame the civil servant. Were you put under pressure?
No, I was not approached by Iain Duncan Smith at all. What I can say to you is we had a vigorous debate, as we always do, about our reports. It's a very tough report. It's extremely critical of the department and the government, and it was unanimously agreed by all the members of my committee from all political parties.
Margaret Hodge, thank you very much. Well, we asked the Department for Work and Pensions for an interview, but no one was available. They're probably busy sorting themselves out. But we are joined by the former Home Office Minister, Nick Herbert, and Jackie Smith is, of course, still with us. Well, Margaret Hodge has given them plenty to think about. I mean, Herbert, why can't governments get this right?
Well, I think you've got to separate out the policy from the delivery and the operational responsibility. And Margaret Hodge says, rather interestingly, well, they've got to take responsibility at the top. What does that mean? The policy is agreed, and actually it's agreed. It's agreed cross-party. So I don't think there's been a policy failure here. There's clearly been an operational failure. This is the second major project where actually, which has exposed, I think, failings in relation to our civil service, in relation to commissioning skills and operational ability. And it's important that that is addressed. Why is it that we have a system where there is no apparent accountability in the leadership, the operational leadership of the department for this? And actually, we have a sort of system of untouchables who run these departments, the permanent secretaries, who remain in place irrespective of these kinds of failures. By the way, we've seen this in other departments as well.
So you're blaming the civil service, so you're blaming the permanent secretary and saying they should take responsibility for the failures in delivery.
What I'm saying is that we have a big problem of accountability here, that what always happens is that in the end, ministers are held accountable for things. Ministers can't, in reality, be responsible for these operational things when they've got the policy right.
What do you say to that, Jackie Smith? Because this is about delivery. Margaret Hodge was clear that there's cross-party consensus broadly on the scheme. Yeah. So should we be blaming civil servants more squarely, or is it really the ministers?
Well, frankly, I think Margaret Hodge was pretty even-handed in saying it was the responsibility both of civil servants and of ministers. And I'm afraid I don't agree with Nick that it's possible as a minister to shuffle off responsibility on the basis of some distinction between operation and policy. Because frankly, this wasn't some small policy in the corner of the DWP. This was Iain Duncan Smith's flagship welfare reform programme. Now, Nick, come on, you've been a minister. This is exactly the type of project where, frankly, you would expect senior ministers, probably weekly, to sit down with the team and say, convince me that progress is going right. Now, either the senior ministers weren't doing that, which is an abrogation of their responsibility, or they were, and the wool was being pulled over their eyes. Either way, it's a ministerial failure.
Right. I mean, in terms of the delivery, surely ministers, and Margaret Hodge says this, hadn't quite appreciated the enormity of the task. If you're merging all these separate benefit payments into one, this was a huge task. Putting a timeline on it was always going to lead to disaster, so says Margaret Hodge.
I mean, I disagree with Jackie about that. Her points, but who Who advises ministers? It's the civil service. Now, it's open to the civil service and its leadership to say to ministers, we don't think that this is deliverable according to the timetable, and they can say that. They can write a formal letter and so on. Once you have a system where the operational leaders say, yes, this is the policy objective, we can achieve this, and so on, they have to be held to account for that. Ultimately, of course, ministers do have to go to Parliament. They have to answer to the public for these failures. But there is a big problem in our system if the operational leaders are never touched when these things go wrong. Because in the end, that is a failure of accountability, and you will get a repetition of these problems. And I think it's a systemic weakness in our system.
I agree with Nick that civil servants shouldn't get away untouched by this. But surely you don't believe, Nick, that as a minister, and I bet you didn't do this when you're a minister, that you simply say, this is the policy, now off you go and deliver it and come back and tell me when you have done it.
And the pressure...
There is
I doubt very much that's what happened in this case.
Except, Nick, as we've discussed, this was the flagship programme. The political pressure was enormous. There was an awful lot at stake here. Do you feel, not that I've tried to defend civil service, but do you think there was a feeling, an atmosphere of, we have to do this come what may, and we'll have to tell ministers that, if that is indeed what happened?
Well, I mean, that's just speculation. I don't know.
Well, that's the claim that's been made.
It may be, but it's always open, as I say, to the senior leadership of the civil service to say to ministers, actually, we don't think this is deliverable. They can formally say that, and so on. Once it's been accepted that that is the timetable, and so on, and if assurances are given that things are going to be delivered, it is the responsibility. We have a permanent civil service.
All right.
That is what ministers inherit. And it has to be made accountable in some way.
Let's move briefly on from the blame game as to who's responsible. Do you think it can work? I mean, do you think it will actually work? Because there is talk of a lot of nervousness at the top of government that actually this universal credit is never going to get online within a reasonable time frame.
Well, there are two questions about can it work and about the timetable. I think there is still a cross-party consensus that universal credit is the right principle because of incentivising people to work. Yes, I think it can be made to work, but I think we do have to look, without blaming, I think we have to look at what skills and capabilities we have in our civil service to deliver major projects of this kind.
It's the right policy. Do you think it can work and should be made to work?
Look, it's a policy which lots of ministers over very many years have thought is a good idea. Many of them have looked at the difficulties of implementation and the cost and backed off. Now, that's not to say I don't think we should necessarily carry on trying. But one of the other important points that Margaret Hodge makes is, in order to test whether or not it can work, it should have been piloted far better than it has been. So perhaps now there needs to be a real focus on proper piloting to see whether or not, in effect, it can work, or if it is simply just too much of a struggle and too difficult to do.
Let's leave it there. Thank you.